Welcome to today's lecture on Chinese immigration in 19th century America, the growth of concerns about the impact of this immigration on post-Civil War American culture and the economy, and the emergence and maturation of efforts to restrict Chinese immigration toward the end of the 19th century. Before we get to the Chinese, though, we need to fill in a bit of history. Although immigration slowed down during the Civil War, the pattern of limited governmental intervention continued. State and local jurisdictions continued to process new arrivals and to provide them with whatever basic services they needed to start their lives. In order to do this, they extracted taxes and bond guarantees from shippers who brought them from Europe to American shores. Shippers felt that such taxes and bond requirements were unfair to them. Their responsibility should be nothing more than safely getting passengers to port and providing local authorities with a manifest including names and other basic identifying information so that they could be efficiently processed on arrival. Shippers sued local authorities, and a few of the cases ultimately ended up in the Supreme Court. In the case of Henderson versus the Mayor of New York in 1875, the Supreme Court reversed its previous position that immigration control fell under local policing powers, arguing not only that state and local authorities had no right to charge head taxes and require bonds for passengers, but also that state and local authorities had no right to control immigration at all, because it was the federal government's exclusive job to regulate foreign commerce. The court also ruled that immigration had to be controlled by the same rules and regulations across the country. In the absence of a federal infrastructure, the Henderson ruling meant that shippers could just drop immigrants off at port, and state and local governments had to deal with the influx of new residents without reliance on head taxes and fees. State and local governments obviously found this situation intolerable and demanded that the U.S. Congress do something about it. After a period of inaction, in 1882, Congress essentially nationalized local and state practices, including inspection services and fees, and authorized states to carry out these laws under the direction of the U.S. Treasury. This essentially returned things to the pre-Henderson status quo, but now the federal government had a direct foothold in immigration issues in a way that it never had before. Which brings us to the topic of Chinese exclusion. Here are the major questions we are going to be addressing during our conversation about Chinese exclusion. Please take a moment to jot these questions down so that you can use them to direct your reading and also help them guide your listening to this lecture. When we begin to think about why the Chinese, in other words, why was it that the Chinese became the first group that were explicitly restricted from entering the United States, it's important to recognize that Chinese immigration was a very small percentage of total immigration, even during the peak years of the 1870s. You can see in this chart that at its peak, Chinese immigration was only 4.4% of total immigration. So that means we really have to wonder, why were Chinese on the radar screen of American policymakers, and who was it that felt threatened enough by them to actually want to limit their immigration to the United States? In order to begin to answer that question, we really must understand the historical context in which this episode takes place. The two most important things to recognize is that this debate about Chinese immigration is taking place after the gold rush and after Reconstruction. So we can begin to think about the economy in the West after the gold rush. There's a large number of people who moved to, particularly to California, but also to Oregon, to participate in the search for gold. And as it becomes clear that not as much gold is going to come out of the earth that many people expected, there's a glut of workers in this region who need to find something else to do. We also have to recognize that the post-Civil War and Reconstruction era is crucial to understanding these debates, because remember, the Republican Party comes to portray itself as the party of equality. So it will be very difficult for the Republican Party to actively partake in efforts to limit one group from entering the United States based on their ethnicity or their race. We also need to recognize that an important faction of the Republican Party consisted of Northeastern businessmen and other business-oriented politicians from around the country who believed that the government should not get involved in labor markets. Further, we also need to keep in mind that the United States was a growing global power. We tend to think of globalization as something that happened primarily in the 20th century, but increased trade networks were already taking shape in the 19th century and even before. One of the outcomes of these growing trade relationships was the Burlingame Treaty, which was a formal recognition on the part of the U.S. and Chinese governments of the trade relationship between the two nations. One of the provisions of the Burlingame Treaty was that Chinese people had a right to settle in the United States, even if they could not become naturalized citizens. Although this certainly did not lead to a large influx of Chinese immigrants, as we saw in the graph a few minutes ago, the mere fact that the right of a particular group of non-Anglo-Saxon people to enter the United States and to settle there was worrisome to many Anglo-Saxon, English descended Americans. They feared the Chinese even more than the Irish. Throughout the next several slides, I'm going to show you several images from a San Francisco-based magazine called The Wasp, which was essentially an organ that promoted white Anglo-Saxon Protestant values and denigrated Chinese and other non-English ethnic groups. In this slide, you can see an image that's titled, "Let the Chinese Embrace Civilization and They May Stay." The point here is that when the Chinese come to America, they will embrace not the values of the United States that Anglo-Saxon English descendants hold precious, but rather they would embrace the whiskey bottle, clearly an association with the Irishman. As you can see in this image, the Wasp magazine wanted to portray the Chinese in a very similar light to the Irishman. They would fight, be unable to take care of themselves, hijack the American democratic system, and generally lower wages and make it more difficult for white Americans to live the American dream. This next image portrays the relationship between the Chinese and the Irish and the ultimate danger of the Chinese very, very clearly. In the top image, we can see that the Chinese are devouring Uncle Sam, the United States, from the feet, while the Irishmen are devouring the United States from the head. In the second image, we can see just how dangerous these two forces were on American culture and society. And in the final image, we can see that once Uncle Sam has been engulfed by the Chinese and the Irish, it was the Chinese that would ultimately engulf the Irishmen, leaving nobody on American soil but Chinese people.